Gütiger und allmächtiger Yahweh, ich trete in Demut vor dich und lade dich in dieses Gebet ein, das ich aus tiefstem Herzen spreche. Du bist der Schöpfer des Universums, der Hüter meiner Seele und die Quelle aller Liebe und Güte. In diesem Augenblick erschaffe ich einen virtuellen Raum durch meine Worte und meine Absicht. Ein Raum, in dem alle eingeladen sind, die positive Energie teilen und empfangen möchten. Mögen sich hier Menschen aus allen Winkeln der Welt versammeln, um einander zu stärken, zu ermutigen und in deiner Liebe zu vereinen. Dieser virtuelle Raum ist zeitlich begrenzt und wird so lange bestehen, bis meine Augen sich für den Schlaf schließen. In dieser begrenzten Zeitspanne soll es ein Ort des Trostes, der Freude und des Friedens sein. Lass uns in Gemeinschaft miteinander wachsen und die Freude teilen, die es bringt, deinem heiligen Pfad zu folgen. Dank sei dir, Yahweh, für deine unendliche Gnade und Barmherzigkeit, die du mir und allen anderen schenkst. Du bist das Licht der Dunkelheit, der Fels in der Brandung und die Hoffnung in Zeiten der Not. Möge deine Führung uns stets begleiten und unser Herz mit deiner Liebe erfüllen. Ich danke auch den Erzengeln, die deinen Willen ausführen und uns beschützen. Dank sei Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel und allen himmlischen Wesen, die uns beistehen. Ihnen sei Dank für eure Fürsorge und euren Beistand. In Demut beende ich dieses Gebet, wissend, dass du meine Worte hörst und mein Herz kennst. Lass diese Gemeinschaft in diesem virtuellen Raum stets von deiner Gegenwart erfüllt sein und möge die positive Energie, die wir hier teilen, in die Welt hinausstrahlen und Segen verbreiten. Im Namen von Jesus Christus. Amen. Hallo, liebes Internet. Ich wünsche euch einen wunderschönen Montagabend. Einen wunderschönen Montagabend. Genau. Ja, ich hatte seit einiger Zeit vor, einen Stream aufzusetzen, der sich mit dem Grabtuch von Turin beschäftigt. Das Grabtuch von Turin, für die, die es nicht wissen, ist einer der wenigen physischen Beweise, die wir haben für Jesus Christus, also zumindest den Menschen, dass es einen Menschen gab, den wir ans Kreuz gehauen haben, der vorher schwer gelitten hat und von dem wir ausgehen, dass es Jesus Christus war oder ist. Und das Grabtuch von Turin ist eins der wenigen Überbleibsel oder physischen Überbleibsel, die wir haben aus dieser Zeit. Es gab auch noch andere, wie zum Beispiel hier dieser Speer, den einer der Soldaten benutzt hat, um Jesus in die Seite zu stechen, ne? Wo Blut und Wasser dann aus Jesus Leib rausgekommen sind, so dieser Speer. Ich glaube, der Film Die Mumie mit Brendan Fraser behandelt zum Beispiel diesen Speer. Oder ich glaube, ein anderes Überbleibsel waren noch Bruchstücke von dem Kreuz selber, an dem Jesus gehangen hat, also Holzsplitter. Und die werden dann als heilige Gegenstände gehandelt. So quasi jeder, der es berührt, ist heilig. Und diese Bruchstücke wurden über die gesamte Welt verteilt, an Gläubige so immer weiter verteilt, bis jetzt kaum noch was davon übrig ist. Ja, und das Grabtuch von Turin ist wie gesagt eins dieser Überbleibsel. So. Jetzt ist die Sache die, über das Grabtuch von Turin wusste ich zwar Bescheid, was ich nicht wusste war, dass es die Wissenschaft vor einer gewissen Hürde stellt. Und zwar, ich muss das jetzt nochmal grob im Kopf zusammenfassen. Wir schauen gleich das Originalvideo, wo ich die Informationen her habe. Und da werde ich mich dann auch korrigieren lassen, falls ich jetzt was falsch sage. Aber es sieht wohl so aus, dass das Grabtuch von Turin, die Abdrücke des Leichnams von Jesus, die in diesem Grabtuch drin sind, in der Intensität, in der diese Abdrücke in das Tuch eingebrannt sind, oder ich sag mal, in der Intensität, in denen die Abdrücke sichtbar sind, der Leichnam war einfach nicht lange genug in dieses Tuch eingewickelt, um so einen intensiven Abdruck in das Tuch hineinzudrücken. Erstmal, weil der Leichnam war ja später weg. Also die Auferstehung Jesu. Der Leichnam war ja weg, dann war nur noch das Grabtuch da. Also der Leichnam hatte nicht genug Zeit, um diesen Abdruck in der Intensität in das Grabtuch einzudrücken. Das zum Ersten. Zum Zweiten ist der Abdruck 400 Nanometer tief in das Gewebe des Tuchs nur eingedrungen. Das ist so viel, glaube ich, wie wenn man ein menschliches Haar nimmt, dann halbiert man es und dann das halbierte Haar nochmal halbiert. So tief ist der Abdruck nur in das Gewebe eingedrungen. Und das auch nur von einer Seite, nicht von beiden Seiten. So, wenn man jetzt mal bedenkt, ne, wenn der Körper mit dem Blut und alles so auf dem Tuch gelegen hat, dann müsste es eigentlich beidseitig sein, aber nein, nur von einer Seite und dann nur 400 Nanometer tief. Ja, und die Sache ist, das stellt die Wissenschaft jetzt vor ein Rätsel, weil jetzt ist die Frage, ja, wenn es jetzt eine Fälschung sein sollte, was bräuchten wir heutzutage, um so eine Fälschung zu reproduzieren, damit die genau diese Qualität hat? Ja, dafür bräuchten wir so viel Energie, die können wir gar nicht aufbringen mit unseren primitiven Methoden, die wir heutzutage haben. Also uns fehlen noch ein paar Generationen an Fortschritt, bis wir diese Energie aufbringen können. Ja, und dann ist das auch nur quasi wie wie wenn man beim Arzt ein Röntgenbild macht. Das ist quasi nur so ein Blitz und dann war der Abdruck in dem Grabtuch und der Leichnam weg. Also wie ein Röntgenbild. Stell dir vor, du machst beim Zahnarzt ein Röntgenbild, so, die machen dir die Platte in den Mund. Dann machen die ein Röntgenbild. In dem Augenblick, wo die das Röntgenbild machen, ist dein Gebiss weg. Aber das Röntgenbild ist noch da, dass dein Gebiss mal dort war. So ungefähr stellt sich die Situation dar. So, und die Wissenschaft ist quasi jetzt am Rätseln, ja, was hat das verursacht? Abgesehen davon, ob es einen Gott gibt oder nicht. Was hat das verursacht? Wie können wir das reproduzieren? Können wir das reproduzieren? Und wenn nicht, ja, was könnte es gewesen sein? Ob es einen Gott gibt oder nicht, sei dann dahingestellt. So grob sieht die Situation aus. Aber ich will jetzt nicht zu viel um den heißen Brei reden. Ich zeige dann jetzt viel lieber, wie das Video, wo ich diese Information her habe, das ist von Pins with Aquinas. Moment, ich teile mal kurz auf jeden Fall im Chat diese Information, damit ihr selber darauf zugreifen könnt. So. Das ist einmal... Oh. Habe ich den Chat gar nicht eingeblendet? So. Und da war die Nachricht wieder weg. Okay. Also noch einmal. Das ist einmal der YouTube-Link für das Video, wo es jetzt hingeht. Und ich mache jetzt einen auf Reaction Andy sozusagen. Wenn ich richtig verstanden habe, was ein Reaction Andy ist, dann ist das, wenn man ein Video guckt und man reagiert dann so auf das Video. So. Genau. Erst einmal meine Cam hier richtig einstellen. So. So, und währenddessen lasse ich dann auch den Chat des Videos laufen, damit ihr das alles dann auch sehen könnt. Jetzt mal gucken, ob mein Chat überhaupt noch eingeblendet ist. Jo. Da unten links. Tatsache. Ja, ich habe die Untertitel des Videos habe ich auf automatisch eingestellt, also auf automatisches Übersetzen. Denn das Video ist leider Gottes nur auf Englisch. Ich mache also automatische Untertitel, die dann auch automatisch auf Deutsch übersetzt werden. Die sind also nicht ganz so präzise, sollte aber trotzdem ausreichend sein, um ja, verfolgen zu können, was in dem Video gesagt wird. Und da würde ich mal sagen, 3 Stunden haben wir vor uns. Keine Ahnung, ob wir die komplett brauchen werden oder ob ich mittendrin dann Schluss mache, wenn alles abgehandelt ist, was ich brauche. Aber jetzt legen wir erst einmal los. Obwohl... nee, ich war gerade war gerade am Überlegen, ob ich Kopfhörer dafür nehme oder nicht, aber lassen wir das. Gut. Ich sehe gerade, meine Chat-Einstellung muss sich noch ändern. Wo haben wir es denn? Nur Follower-Modus? So, nur Follower-Chat. Okay. So, jetzt sollte eigentlich jeder in der Lage sein zu schreiben. Ja, das Einzige, was ich mache, ist Slow-Modus 30 Sekunden, um Spam zu verhindern. Okay. Dann legen wir mal los.
Your phone, mute your computer. Welcome to Pints with Aquinas. I'm here today with Father Andrew Dalton, who is an expert on the Shroud of Turin. And I'm really pumped to learn about this because it was awesome to meet you.
Okay, damit das nicht alles doppelt hörbar ist und das Echo, oder um das Echo zu verhindern, ziehe ich jetzt Kopfhörer auf.
Several weeks ago. Yeah.
Ah. Ja.
In Rome, and to have you
geht
give
doch.
me and the
Okay.
Bertuzinator, Cameron Bertuzzi, a tour. I was really blown away, so I'm so pumped about this episode.
Yeah, there's everything in that exhibit. I wish we could like transport ourselves there, but I think it's gonna be cool also just to chat it out and have a conversation.
Yeah.
There's lots of stuff on the Shroud already online, but I think a conversation allows to kind of tease out some things that maybe people watching will also want to ask about. So hope that
Yeah.
works.
For those who aren't aware of you, who are you?
Oh yeah.
I'd love to know about your expertise in this and how long you've been studying it.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Father Andrew Dalton, and I'm an American priest that's living in Rome. I teach at a pontifical university, and one of the things that I teach is Shroud Studies, specifically the biblical theology of the Passion of Christ according to the Shroud of Turin. So it's kind of like the pastoral and spiritual, but also the theology that accompanies the sufferings of Christ as we know them by the Shroud of Turin. So we can unpack that more, but I was there in Rome studying philosophy and theology and bumped into the Shroud. I really didn't think that I would specialize in this. My background was in engineering, though. Like my strong subjects in school when I was a kid were maths and sciences. And then I just kind of derailed all that to join the priesthood when I was 20 years old and collided with this Shroud expert who had written dozens of books on the Shroud, spent over 30 years studying it.
Who
And
is this?
her name is Emanuela Marinelli, and she came to our university. And this priest friend of mine said, "You have to hear her speak." And I said, "Look, I got places to go, things to do. I'll sit in for a little bit, but I'll probably have to sneak out after a few minutes." And I was glued to my chair. She was absolutely riveting. I quite literally lost sleep that night. I was so excited to hear about the Shroud. I was like, how in the world am I 10 years a seminarian and I've never heard this stuff? Like the world needs to know it. And so I stayed long, I think like 3 hours with Emanuela. We've since become friends and have appeared on television together, et cetera. We're quite close. This is now like 11 years later, probably, because that was the first generation of the postgraduate certificate in Shroud study. Do you know you could study the Shroud for a year in a pontifical university?
Wow.
People don't know how much there is out there, but this is the most studied archaeological object in the history of the world.
Say that again for people.
The most studied archaeological object in the history of the world. And so when it comes to historical
Das meist untersuchte archäologische Objekt in der Geschichte der Welt. Das Grabtuch von Turin. Deswegen hat es mich auch vom Hocker gehauen, wenn ich Leute in meinem Umfeld darauf angesprochen habe, auf das Grabtuch. Wie, was ist das denn? Noch nie von gehört. Aha, okay. So, den meisten in meinem Umfeld ist das gänzlich unbekannt.
events. Like what you're looking for is monumentum et documentum, right? That you have a monument and a document. And of course, we're all familiar that there are documents telling about Jesus's passion, but many people don't know about the Shroud, at least to the degree that one can know. And so here's what happened with Emanuela. I stayed talking with her. She said, wait till you come back next week because there's a physicist he'll be speaking.
Yeah, if you lost sleep last night,
Yes,
buckle
exactly.
up.
And he was just that way. His name is Paolo Di Lazzaro. He spent 5 years, this guy, just trying to reproduce by ultraviolet light.
That's amazing.
On a linen, just playing with the variables of light, amplitude, frequency, duration of exposure, so that he could recreate an image like that of the Man of the Shroud on another linen. And this guy made himself famous when he published an article saying that the amount of energy you would need to recreate a similar image would be 34,000 billion watts. And of
34.000 Milliarden Watt.
course, you've probably bumped into this on the internet now. But
What does that look like?
well, it's not a matter of what it looks like so much as, I mean, what it
would
looks
that
like.
do?
Well, here's the trouble. You see, this is why it took 5 years, right? Because he took these different variables of light, trying to reproduce something caramel colored on a linen.
Yeah.
But it was frustrating because he got either nothing or just charred the linen altogether.
Yeah.
Which obviously we don't have.
I really want to get into that.
Yeah.
But I know we want to go into that in depth. So can we just start really
Back up.
basically? So when did you actually first see the shroud? Was it after you heard this lecture?
Yeah. So
And then tell people what the shroud is. Give them the basic definition for those who are like, I think I know what it is, but
sure. Yeah. There's a lot there. We'll go slow. Sure. So I first bumped into this exhibit. I say the shroud talk by Marinelli. I want to say that was 2000 and is it 11? The first year that we started. I'm gonna have to think back to that. But I lost sleep, I told you, and met these different experts. They were wanting to explain what the shroud is, who the Man of the Shroud is, and what significance it had. All part of a Pontifical University's program to give you a panoramic view of shroud studies, so interdisciplinary. But the basic premise is that we've been reverencing this cloth down through the ages as the burial shroud that wrapped the body of Jesus. So again, Jesus, of course, is on the cross on Good Friday, but he's taken down and then laid in the tomb. Well, when he's laid in the tomb, he's wrapped in these clothes. We should spend some time in that passage of John where it's written about.
yeah, we'll get there.
But before, just to kind of lay it all out, the church proposes to have exactly that. At least that's what's on display in Turin, that is 4.5 hours north of Rome by the fast train. You can go and see this relic, which is on display in the cathedral there. And that's to say, it's inside of a case, and only on special occasions do they take. It's out of a double case, like in inert gas and constant temperature and pressure, never exposed to more than 50 lux of light. We want to preserve this thing for future generations. Now, so I started to meet those guys, the authorities, the ecclesial authorities in Turin, a few years later. So now I'm on Othonia as part of this non-for-profit, that's International Group for Shroud Study. And so I go there regularly. We just had a meeting a few weeks ago, but they have a shroud museum. They have an international study of shroud studies, and they provide many of the experts that teach at our Pontifical University. So at the one hand, you had this hub of study, like the minds that were involved in probing this document to understand its mysteries. And the other side, you had these museums that would kind of showcase or create a space of experience with the shroud. Those are two different kind of questions, right? Some people just know the image and they dive into prayer and contemplation through that. And that's one way to experience the shroud for sure. But another is to roll up your sleeves, get the experts on scene to study the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the forensic medicine, and then the history, the art history. There, like I say, so many different. So lead me where you want to lead me.
No, that's good. And we're going to get into all the objections to why the shroud may not be authentic. But when do we first have evidence in literature of the existence of the shroud?
Yeah, if you want to follow the paper trail backwards.
Paper or even icon trail, there might be images of it.
Right. So you're going to get different answers depending on what database you're looking at. But so many people point to the year 1354 because that was when it was on display in the hands of a certain Geoffroy de Charny in France, in Lirey. And he and this, we have his stamp, we have his seal, family crest. Nobody doubts that in 1354, what he was looking at and what was on display is the shroud, as we call it today, the Shroud of Turin. Prior to that, there's evidence, but it is controverted evidence. Like you say, it'll be things like icons. So the typical one is the Mount Sinai Pantocrator in St. Catherine's. And there...
Could we throw up the image of the shroud just so people can kind of see what we're talking about?
Yeah, in fact, I should describe what you're looking at there because it's not immediately obvious.
Which one is that?
Yeah, so let's look at... first do slide 6, okay? And I think at the top of the picture, you'll see a kind of tan or beige picture.
Would you be able to tilt that a little?
And we'll zoom in on some of the
That's
particulars
perfect.
here.
Thank you. That's more than perfect. You don't have to give me that much.
Yeah, that's okay. So at the top you see, this is a really long cloth. It's hard to see perhaps in our computer screen how wide this is, but this is 14 feet, so 13 foot 7 inches to be exact, and then 3 foot 7 is its height. So that's like 4.4 meters by 1.1 meters. And what you see on the left side of the linen is the frontal image of the body.
Right.
And then on the right side is the dorsal image of the body. So it actually wrapped all the way around. In fact, there's another picture that I've got in here. Let me pull it up. So this will explain very easily. Here we go. Go to slide 13. This is just a painting, but it shows this angel holding up in the clouds the linen, and just below the shroud is at the foot of the cross. You have Jesus wrapped in this cloth. It's simply to depict. It's kind of a didactic photo, so you can understand how he was lying both on top of the body, and then it's so long that it wraps around the back of his head, over his face, and over his stomach. So now when you unfold it, you get what is in the hands of the angel there.
When was that painting produced?
This is much later. I want to say it's the 16th or maybe 17th century.
Okay.
But it's simply a good way of visually understanding that it's only the inside of the cloth. Many people don't know this, that the shroud is colorized. It's imaged on only one side of the cloth. So it's the side that touches his body. And in fact, it's so superficial that if you were to just gently graze with a razor blade, you would erase the image of the man forever. This is what Paolo de Lazzaro discovered. If I can just dive a little detail, because this is so interesting. If you ask the question, like, what's the depth of penetration, of coloration on the surface of the shroud? The answer is mind-boggling. It's 200 to 500 nanometers, which is, that's not even a number that I can fathom. So I give this example of a human hair. Like, take a single human hair. Imagine you could very carefully with your scissors cut it in half along its long end and discard that half. And now with what remains, try to cut it in half again. Do that 4 or 5 times until you're left with 1/16 or 1/20th of the width of a human hair. That's the depth of penetration.
And so as you say, that is on...
Okay, das ist sogar noch viel wesentlich weniger, als ich vorhin gesagt habe. So, ich habe ja gesagt, das Haar halbieren und die Hälfte nochmal halbieren. Noch 4 oder 5 Mal. Krass.
One side of the shroud, but not on the other.
In
so
fact,
if you were using some instrument to paint or imprint this image, you would likely see it on the other side.
That's right. There's nothing soaked into the fibers. In fact, that was one of the main questions. That was one of the main theories on the table when this gets tested. I'm sure we'll get into those testings in a moment. But one of the theories was that this was a painting, and so this was pigment, either organic or inorganic. Maybe it's a dye, maybe it's an ink of some sort. And so they had made a list of the chemical properties of all of the pigments known to man throughout history. And they do a certain test called pyrolysis mass spectroscopy that would not only find it, but identify its chemical composition. While sweeping the whole shroud, you don't find any of that. Not a single dose of little dot or drop of pigment, organic or inorganic. No varnish, no dye, no directionality whatsoever with which some liquid is applied to the cloth. And again, it doesn't soak into the fibers. It's like the bloodstains do. You can see them on the other
fascinating.
side. A great experiment is to just take transmitted light, like a regular light bulb, walk to the other side of the shroud, and you'll see the bloodstains because now they'll be backlit.
Yes.
And you'll see them all the more. But guess what you won't see?
The image of the
the
man.
body image of the man. It just disappears. It's so superficial and so frail
Wow.
that it's overpowered by just simple light on the other side. And so this is what we're unable to produce today, even artificially, even after all this study, even though 2023 now, we don't have a micro laser capable of delivering a micro burn this precise. And so the obvious question is, how in the world did this come into being? Like, what's the genesis of this enigmatic image?
Ja, das ist schon mal krass. So. So, als ich versucht habe, das einem Kollege zu erklären, der hat sich direkt komplett verschlossen. Der hat direkt gesagt, nein, ich will das auch gar nicht, nein, ich will jetzt nicht glauben, ist mir egal. Da habe ich gesagt, na, du sollst ja noch nichts glauben oder wegmachen, so, du sollst darüber nachdenken, was das gewesen sein könnte. Nein, schon, weißt du, der hat sich direkt komplett verweigert.
Before we get further, I know that people are going to come in with these thoughts of, wasn't this disproved? So it might be helpful to show why that isn't the case before we go on to kind of assuage people's...
Right, let's do that. Okay, so slide 3 here shows some pictures. This is probably what you saw on Front Page News in 1988.
Look
pictures
at that.
of Dr.
That must
Michael
frustrate you
Tait.
so much looking at that.
Can you see the 1260-1390 exclamation part? That's the exclamation part that really, it just screams academic excellence and propriety, doesn't it?
Yes.
These same guys with this very composed stance with their arms folded before these pillars. It just says these same guys got what's the number? I'm going to forget, like how many million in sterling they got for their new museum. Like the next day, it's a matter of the public record. The moment this was published, they were able to build their new laboratory. Some stuff was very fishy from the start, but it's just the case that across the world, front page news everywhere was the Turin shroud it's been proven to be a medieval fake. It tells us nothing, therefore, about Jesus' sufferings. It can't be considered a relic, etc., etc. And so if you still believed that the shroud was real after this point, you might as well believe that the earth is flat. You're about the same category. And my heart just goes out for those people who are serious students, or the ones who had dedicated hundreds of thousands of hours, especially the team from STIRP in 1978. These guys had published already over 20 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. They knew from the start to be suspicious of this.
Really?
But what I like, and this I would lead with this now, is that as of 2017, we have a published article that shows that the conclusions from 1988 are no longer sustainable. So I should say that again, the very publication, Archaeometry, out of Oxford, that published this 1260 to 13, it said that conclusion can no longer be sustained. And I'm
sure that hit the front pages all around the world too, right?
Right. No, exactly. So though it is a matter of mainstream science. So if you want to find in the literature, you're going to bump into this. The French researcher who published this article is Tristan Casabianca, another friend of ours who teaches at our university. And he goes into all the details. It's a fascinating story. But I want to say it was in 2017 that according to the Freedom of Information Act, these laboratories were compelled by law to release the raw data that shows how heterogeneous were their individual results, because there was Oxford, Zurich, Oxford, and Arizona. Those were the 3 laboratories. And the idea was that they were going to publish independently and that their particular results, but that didn't happen. They lumped them together and gave us this big arc, 1260 to 1390, 95% sure that this is the time period from which the shroud hails, and so it's fake. But the bottom line is that they use a sample from the top left corner of the shroud, which we know to be anomalous. It's just not representative of the rest of the shroud. And we knew that, and we had proof of that 10 years prior. You would think somebody would have the sense.
Do you think they knew that?
Well, they ought to have known. That much we know. We knew, though, that in the moment that they're cutting the sample, 8 centimeters of the most prized relic in all of Christendom, and of course you know that with carbon dating, you carbonize it as you destroy, you put into a fire, basically, this cloth never to be seen again. And so you'd think you'd be very careful. Like, compare that to the STIRP team, this Shroud of Turin research project of 1978. For a whole year, they prepare just so all of their tests will be non-invasive, non-destructive. And yet here, we're about to destroy forever 8 centimeters, and they don't know where they're going to take the sample 2 hours prior to the experiment. And it's all on videotape. In Italy, there was a documentary that came out just telling this whole fiasco, and it's called La Notte della Sindone. It's the night of the shroud, and you know who does the narrating, if I'm not mistaken, is the same actress. I'm going to forget her name now, who plays the devil in The Passion of the Christ. Yeah. So it's got some fun imagery there. It's a little...
On the nose.
Yeah, exactly. It's a little edgy, but the fact is, I can understand why some people were upset. But here's the thing: even if you think that those laboratories did good science, and I'm willing to, be benevolent and say as much, even if they did perfect science, they did so on a sample that tells us literally nothing about the rest of the shroud. Like, you could look at the chemical composition, like you can see a map, what's called a brightness map from the UV fluorescence. Like, turn off the lights, shine UV, capture what fluoresces, and it tells you about the chemical composition of the cloth. It's all uniform. It's all like orange hues, maybe a little yellow, a little red, but it's not forest green. But that's exactly what color it is in that top left corner. Like, a little kid in kindergarten can point to that and say, look, Mom, that part is different. And yet this is where these, world-renowned scientists are using to date the shroud. It's just...
So why not take another piece of the shroud and carbon date that? Wouldn't that be enough to prove what you want to prove?
Yes, except that you can imagine that after this very embarrassing episode, many people are hesitant to go that way. I think the church would be, remember, it's the church that's paying for this. Cardinal Ratzinger at the time was saying, yeah, these are protocols. Absolutely. Let's do 7 samples, 7 laboratories.
About how much does that cost?
Yeah, I have no idea. That I didn't see. But and sadly, that got reduced to first 3 samples and then 1, and then they published together against their own protocols.
Were these fellas alive when it got retracted?
That I don't know, because here we are 30 years later. So 2017, it's like
that's when the same publishing outfit retracted it.
Yeah, it may even be 2019 by the time that gets published. 2017, I think, is when the first research is done, and then but it's worth looking up. Even on the internet, you can find, or on shroud.com. That's like the mecca of all scientific data.
What's it called? The Shroud?
Just shroud.com.
Do you mind putting that in Thursday?
Yeah, so that's led by Barry Schwartz, who is the teacher. So right after I was telling you, I met Emanuela, then Paolo, and then Barry Schwartz. He's got a white ponytail. Have you seen this guy? A big white beard. No. He's super fun. He's Jewish, and so he was my buddy. Like, when he came to Rome, and he gave an extended course on shroud studies, because he was up close and personal with the cloth in 1970 as technical photographer. You have to realize that this is all the people that came together from the highest powered laboratories across America when they discovered that the shroud encodes 3D information. So in addition to the fact that the man's body is anatomically perfect, that it acts as a photo negative, we'll put a little bookmark on that. And then when it encodes 3D information, this is what's going to mobilize these laboratories across the states to then petition the royal family in the Savoy in Turin to study hands-on the shroud for 5 days, 120 consecutive hours.
What did that look like?
And, well, here's a picture. So if you want to see when they bring 80 crates of the most state-of-the-art material overseas to study, they just want to answer one question, which is...
What number is that for him?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So this is... What does that say? 11. So this is the team on the top left Thursday? Corner. Yeah. This is John Jackson here looking at the shroud, which is mounted on this like stainless steel, like they brought overseas so that everything, it was by magnets, so as not to like prick or like destroy in any way. Everything was to be non-invasive. They almost create a international scandal when they can't get through customs with all this state-of-the-art material. But the question isn't religious at this point. It's really important to highlight that it's simply, you've got Catholics and Protestants and atheists and Jews and agnostics and everything else under the sun. And their only question is to answer by what mechanism, by what means was this image produced? Because we've never seen anything like it. And to this day, we've never been able to reproduce anything like it, especially at the microscopic level. So that really does invite the question, right? If it's not a painting, if it's not a scorch, if it's not a rubbing, if it's not a camera oscura, right? Some sort of medieval photography. Well, then what in the heck is it?
Wow.
And their
So this is
conclusion-
something, sorry.
Sorry, just to tell you what they came home with is more questions than answers.
Wow.
Because they don't tell you what it is. They tell you what it's not. They say it's not human artwork. It's not made by
It's like via negativa.
exactly. It's
Ja, das ist doch schon einmal der wichtigsten Punkt überhaupt. Es ist nicht menschengemacht. So, das ist doch schon mal ein Punkt, mit dem kann man arbeiten. Es ist nicht von Menschenhand gemacht. Wessen Hand könnte es vielleicht gewesen sein? Nein. Ja, Gott kann es nicht gewesen sein. Das wäre ja hirnrissig, etwas wie Gott da in diese Theorie mit einzubeziehen.
they leave open this question of how it's made, and so that really does leave room for the theory that many, of course, Christians have proposed: is what if it's the natural effect of a supernatural event? What if it's after the resurrection, or in the moment of the resurrection, whatever that looks like, that produced this image? So some things, even from a scientific or empirical point of view, point in that direction. So, for example, the bloodstains compared to the body image. So here's a question that I like to ask: is like, if you're a con artist, if you're a forger, if you're trying to present to the world an image that you made but make it look real, what would you do? Would you paint the body first and then paint the bloodstains? Or would you first start with the bloodstains and then after the fact add the body?
Probably the first way.
Exactly. So what happens if you do the bloodstain for like the head and your neck needs to be like 2 foot long, right? That just doesn't work, right? So it's clear that any artist would start with the body and then add the blood on top, but that's not the case. So the shroud is actually not imaged wherever there's blood. So the blood was there first and it's protecting those fibers, because underneath those bloodstains, there's no imaging of the shroud. And this, of course, we found out in the modern era, because shroud science is born in the 20th century. Like, that's when we really started to study this thing, after the first photograph. Maybe that's something we should talk about, because it's worth saying. I think if I can go back to, let's go back to this slide here. Well, I'll tell you what, right here. Okay. This is slide 4. It's a picture of Secondo Pia. This is the amateur photographer that snapped the first photo of the shroud in 1898. This is about 60 years after the invention of these first dactylographs. This is a monstrous machine. You can see it on, if you go to Turin, they have it on display in the museum there. And this guy, I love this. Like, what if you're the family that owns the burial shroud of Jesus, and you like to add a little pageantry to your family wedding or baptism? You just, I'll whip out that burial shroud of Jesus.
Did you get that photo up? Oh, you got it. Yeah.
Of Secondo Pia? Yeah, so this is the guy that after 15 minutes of developing the film goes into the dark room. And in this next slide 3.
That is just...
This is great. So
this is the one everyone's seen.
Yeah, so this is an image of the face. Now we're zoomed in on the face. On the right side of the
you
screen.
Get that number...
Number 5. It's the juxtaposition of the two facial images on the right. It's the positive image, the linen itself in beige. And if we're honest, like, okay, I can kind of make out a face. Like, there's 2 eyes, there's a nose, something like a mustache and a beard if I'm kind of creative and I squint a little bit. But if we're honest, like, it's hard to make out the details. But Secondo Pia was the first one to ever lay eyes on the photo negative.
Wow.
And so he goes to the dark room, and after a time, very slowly, this image comes to fruition. Yeah, and so he sees like the subtle, for example, I like to mention the eyes, because if I were to ask you, just pointing at the positive image, the one of the linen, like, where are the boundaries of the eyeballs? You might be very inclined to like do like a Bart Simpson kind of thing, where you have these big bulging eyebrows, because it seems like these are like the outlines to the eyes. And that explains, by the way, many icons that show again and again Jesus with all of these same characteristics, one of them being these bulging eyes. But when you get to the negative of that, all of a sudden you see a very clear, intelligible human face, that this is marking the subtle contours around the eye sockets, the details of the separation of the lips. You've got this swelling in the cheeks. You've got a separated septum. If you come 2/3 down the nose, you can see that the cartilage has been separated according to the American scientists. The beard has been plucked.
Wow.
You
are kidding.
you can see things like the arterial blood that flows near the temple. It's from the frontal vein that's here at the center of the forehead. We could go on and on about some of these details.
Keep doing it.
We will. But what I want to say now is that the first thing to be noticed in 1898 was that this was too good to be true.
I see.
Instead of applauding Secondo Pia, they
accused him,
pointed fingers at him to say, "Come on, where did you really get this?"
Wow.
And it's not until 1931, that's some 3 decades later, that Giuseppe Enrie, now a professional photographer working on orthochromatic film, which produces some of the most beautiful photos to this day because of the kind of colors that we find. It's these kind of warm hues that you find on the shroud. In any case, he does this experiment of photographing the whole length of the shroud and sees that indeed the shroud is a photo document. It's when you take the negative of the shroud that you don't arrive at a negative. The negative is the positive image, which suggests, and this is the mind-boggling part, right? Is that what is the shroud then? A photo negative? Tell me how that works. 19 centuries before the invention of photography, we have a photographic effect in the linen itself. And so it's going to be Yves Delage, who in Paris picks up on this, just noticing the anatomical perfection of this body and that the pathologies that this man suffered are just right on 1,000 different details, and they correspond to what we know of Jesus' sufferings. And so this is an agnostic, he's not a believer, right? But he writes a paper saying that the man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth. And they laugh him out of the scientific community. They won't publish his paper.
Mitbekommen? Ein Agnostiker hat das Grabtuch untersucht, hat festgestellt, dass der Mann, der da eingewickelt war in diesem Grabtuch, was der durchlitten hat, und anhand der Leiden, die er ermitteln konnte, also die der Mann durchlitten haben muss, der in das Tuch eingewickelt war, ist dieser Agnostiker zu dem Ergebnis gekommen, dass dieser Mann womöglich oder wahrscheinlich Jesus von Nazareth ist oder war. Und prompt wird er von der wissenschaftlichen Gemeinschaft ausgelacht, ausgebuht und verunglimpft. Ein Agnostiker. Einer, der gar kein Interesse daran hat, ob es Jesus oder Gott gibt oder nicht. So, der eher der Auffassung ist, nein, gib es nicht, gab es nicht.
In the minutes. And so he has to lament to his friend that, if I were writing about Xerxes or some pharaoh or something, no one would have any trouble. But they're scandalized for some reason that I found a trace of Jesus of Nazareth's existence. But he's like, why is that a problem? I don't get it. And yet to this day, we see that anything related to Christ is a sign of contradiction.
Because you brought up a point a moment ago that needs to be, I think, re-emphasized, that at this point you don't have to believe this is a supernatural artifact.
That's right.
And so someone could agree that this is the shroud that covered the body of Jesus Christ and still not believe that Christ rose from the dead, that Christianity is true.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's kind of like, well, even if it is authentic, so what? Like, what does that show us? And I know some people online get very enthusiastic and they go so far as to say that they think the shroud is like a proof of resurrection. Or I actually am more cautious than that. I do think it's a sign of resurrection. I think that it's certainly compatible and even kind of knocks at the door of your heart saying, come on, explain me. But
ja, genauso wie bei meinem Kollege so. Ich habe so mit ihm über das Grabtuch gesprochen, so, und dann hat er dann auch so gesagt, aber ich will nicht an Gott glauben und so, oder ich sagte, ja, muss er ja nicht. So, aber der Mann, der in das Tuch eingewickelt war, von dem man dann ausgeht, dass es Jesus von Nazareth war, also der Mensch, so, der hat aber gesagt, ja, wer an mich glaubt und dass es Gott gibt, der kommt. So, wärst du denn bereit, das wenigstens oder zuzulassen oder wenigstens die Möglichkeit zu öffnen? So, da hat er sich dann quasi immer noch dem verweigert, weil als es dann darum ging, dass der Leichnam verschwunden ist, Ja, und niemand eine Erklärung hat, was mit dem Leichnam passiert ist. Und wir haben nur diese paar 100 Nanometer tiefen Abdrücke in dem Grabtuch. Ja, da hat er sich dann ganz verweigert. So, da hat er nicht mal mehr den Geist öffnen wollen, um Möglichkeiten, was passiert sein könnte oder wie es gewesen sein könnte, überhaupt noch zuzulassen. Er hat sich direkt komplett verschlossen. Komplett.
At the very least, so much is like having the right questions. Sometimes we start with a certain bias, a sort of like predisposition to answer just one question. And a lot of the talk and a lot of ink is spilt on radiocarbon dating and is it authentic? I think the better question to ask is, who is this man? Like, just here's the data, explain it, right? It's there. It demands an explanation. That's a better starting point. Just gather all the data and see where it leads. You don't have to start with the conclusion of Christianity or not, or the opposite, right? You can actually just be open to where...
It's like a philosophical argument for God's existence. Like, the world exists, something exists, now explain that.
It's exactly that. And I think...
Ja, aber das ist schon für manche zu viel. Weil es könnte ja dazu führen, dass genau diese Sachen oder Möglichkeiten, dass die wahr sein könnten. So, und das finde ich dann interessant, dass bei den Leuten, die sich komplett davor verschließen, die Gott ausschließen wollen oder dass Jesus existiert hat. Und wenn man denen dann diese Daten gibt, also die handfesten Daten, und dann sagt, ja, dann erklär mir das so. Und dann, ja, nee, kann ich nicht erklären, will ich nicht erklären, so, es interessiert mich auch nicht. Ich glaube nicht an Gott, so, dann, ja, was willst du da machen? Ich habe dann gesagt, du sollst doch nicht an Gott glauben, so, du sollst dann nur wenigstens erklären, so, ne, was das für dich aussagt. So, die Daten, die dann da sind. Und dann, ja, nee, will ich nicht, warum reden wir überhaupt darüber? Lass über was anderes reden. Die sind direkt komplett, bam, allein schon die Möglichkeit, dass es wahr sein könnte, verschließt sie komplett.
That we have gone both wrong in both directions, either from a bias of scientism that a priori excludes the possibility of miracles and the resurrection, or on the other hand kind of begins with, we already know that now, what do we even need science for in the first place? And I think both of those are wrong. Like, I much prefer what Pope St. John Paul II would say in his first line of the encyclical Fides et Ratio, where he says faith and reason are two wings by which the human spirit ascends to the contemplation of the truth. I was like, here's the perfect case study for that. Like, just try it out. Like, faith and reason. Come with your instruments, come with your, X-ray, your infrared, your ultraviolet, your spectroscopy, your pyrolysis mass spectroscopy, your sticky tape samples, your blood samples. Bring it on. Just like, that's what the church was inviting us to do.
Wow.
There's a letter, a very powerful one from Pope St. John Paul II, actually, and he was inviting researchers, even non-believers, to press, to probe, just leave your bias at the door, just like everybody else, and just let's see where it goes. And what we find out, of course, is that it's a mirror of the gospel, is that it actually at so many levels coincides with the gospel story we've always heard recounted. It's just now we have a fifth witness. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It's the shroud testifying to these to the passion.
Yeah, I want to get to that. I want to get to how the shroud mirrors the gospels. But I guess a few questions first. Is there any credible scientist today making claims about this shroud being inauthentic or dating back to maybe the Middle Ages? And what is their best argument?
The best argument is the carbon dating. There's no doubt that when you're talking about a linen, which is organic material, the gold standard is carbon dating. Like, there are other means of dating, like with vanillin or with, if there are evidence of coins, that's one way. You could also look to the icons to see. You could, if there's the sudarium, in other words, third parties, the other types of artifacts that would in some say kind of meet the itinerary, the provenance of the shroud. So, for example, just to make this practical, the sudarium is the headcloth that covered the body of Christ, according to John chapter 20. Well, we have that. It's in Spain, and the bloodstains are extremely amorphous, and yet they, when juxtaposed onto the shroud, align.
Oh my
And
goodness.
the qualities of the blood
That's
is very, very
remarkable.
specific, right? So you've got a proportion of blood to water that indicates lung edema, and that's someone who's been scourged, someone who's been severely beaten suffers exactly that. But this is the one that really gets me. If you look to the blood stain, the rivulet of blood, and we looked at the face a moment ago, perhaps we can pull up that same slide that shows that kind of reverse 3-shape rivulet or an epsilon, and then at the base of it there's a little droplet, there's a little circle. I love this because the rim is outlined on the shroud. If you look to the sudarium, you get this same blood stain, but what's empty on the shroud is filled up on the other.
Have you got it up there?
And so that's just one example.
Wow.
You could read up on the work of, I think his name is Alejandro Hermosillo from Valencia. There's a shroud studies over there, and there's a center for shroud studies, and he's done some work on the comparative analysis of the shroud on the one hand and the sudarium on the other. But we know the provenance of the sudarium. It was on display in 611, I want to say, certainly the beginning of the 7th century. And so the shroud, if it covered the same body, is at least as old as that, right? And so we talked already about the Mount Sinai Pantocrator from the 6th century as well. There's many other icons from the later medieval period. So these are other ways of dating the shroud. But I want to say, and this just I think is this is just the fact. Like when it comes to organic material, there's no better way to date it than radiocarbon dating.
So why isn't an objection, well, then carbon date it again?
No,
if you're so intent
Right.
on showing that this is authentic, then the church shouldn't be afraid to,
Well, that's right. I think
especially if you have more of an understanding of what may be a newer part of the shroud. Was that the problem?
yeah, so we could get into that too. So that top left corner
Yeah.
is exactly where you'd grab the shroud. Like if you wanted to put it on display, and we have like lithograph images of this where the bishop is with his bare hands just holding up the shroud for hours. Yeah, and that's what you would literally do. You can imagine like making your pilgrimage across Italy to land just so you could have a few brief moments.
Yeah.
And this is what always happened whenever there was a public display.
People would just pick it up.
Yeah, they'd go and people would march from across
You have
Europe.
nightmares of this, don't you? You just wake up at night in the cold sweat.
But imagine the soil, the wear and tear on that
my
top left
gosh.
corner.
Okay,
And-
so it's not that it was a newer part of cloth.
Well, here, let me
Or-
finish that story. So, because of the wear and tear, it's very likely that it needed to be repaired in the 16th century. So there was a fire in 1532, and these nuns basically tended to the shroud after the fact. Did they add a strip of new material? This is one of the theories. There's a fun little story behind this. There's this woman who's watching TV. Her name is Sue Benford. She's not a scientist. She's a librarian, if I'm not mistaken. She's since passed away, but she's watching this on TV and she says, "That face convinces me that's Jesus. I got to study this thing." So get this. She gets a picture, like a blown up image of the textile, and then shows it to textile experts. And again, without knowing what they're looking at, they simply describe what they see. A misaligned weave. They tell her about French invisible weave. The idea is that you would put one thread or one cloth next to another, and without putting like a seam in between the two cloths, you create what's called a splice. You would unravel the threads on the one end, do the same on the new cloth, and then just splice the threads together so that it looks like one piece. It's very expensive, it's very difficult, but it was known, and we have books about it, in the 16th century. The problem is that the new material is going to be white with respect to the linen that has yellowed over time. And so they added a plant gum that's new organic material now in order to make it all uniform color. And so this was studied long after the fact, even after Sue Benford presents a paper in Orvieto at one of these shroud congresses, and it gets published on the most scientific website online, which is shroud.com. And this is when the head chemist of the STURP, the Shroud of Turin research project, his name is Ray Rogers, he gives Barry Schwartz a call and says, "What are you doing publishing this paper from the lunatic fringe on our scientific website?" And he was like, "Well, Ray, I mean, she follows the scientific method. I think the people ought to know what a good hypothesis is. And hey, if it needs to be scrutinized and destroyed, well, let it be so, you know? And he's like, I'm going to prove it wrong in 5 minutes. He's like, well, Ray, go ahead. You know, they hang up the phone. Imagine this. Ray was at STRP again in 1978. I'm not sure what year this is, but I want to say around 2000, somewhere there, because Ray Rogers is dying of cancer. This guy's like racing against the clock to prove his theory. But what happens when he hangs up the phone is he goes back to, I guess, his little manila folder or whatever, where he's got a little strip of the shroud. He went home with a sample of the shroud that he could put under a microscope and examine, and he finds cotton. Of course, the shroud has no cotton. It's all linen. But he says, I can't believe I'm saying this, Barry, calling him back now, but I think she's right. And so Barry Schwartz will like race against the clock, all the time he's got left on this earth, to present one last paper and show and arguing in favor of this theory of French invisible weave, basically that although the shroud be from the 1st century, there was a strip that's from the 16th century, so that what those different laboratories were actually analyzing was a blend of 1st century and 16th century material, thus giving us this medieval date, which is, of course, an average. Because I don't know if you know, I should explain for our listeners how radiocarbon works.
Please. And for me.
Yeah, so any of us that are alive and breathing are taking in oxygen and replenishing.
Ihr fragt einer, how many criminals that were crucified were crowned with a crown of thorns? Also, das wurde nicht nur mit Jesus gemacht, soweit ich weiß. Das wurde mit mehreren oder einigen Kriminellen gemacht. Also Jesus war, glaube ich, nicht der Einzige, dem das angetan wurde. Ich könnte mich aber auch täuschen.
Our carbon all the time. So if you look at a table of elements, you're going to see the periodic table. You're going to see that it's carbon 12 because of the number of protons that it has. But there are other isotopes too, other flavors of carbon, if you like. C14 is radioactive. So it sheds those extra protons over time at a known rate. And so we know the half-life, how long it takes for this C14 to shed this extra material. And so 5,370 years, I want to say, is the half-life of C14, which simply means I take a sample, I shove it in a machine, I calculate the molecules that are there, and I get an exact date of when that plant died, or when that person died in the case of human biological material.
Okay.
But it simply means that the flax from which linen comes was chopped down in the 1st century. It stopped replenishing.
Okay, nochmal. (5370 Jahre)
I want to say is the half-life of C14.
Ist die Halbwertszeit von C14. Interessant, weil nach hebräischem Kalender, also den Kalender des Gottes von Israel, haben wir das Jahr 5783. Das ist schon krass, wie lange die Halbwertszeit ist. Einfach nur mal so nebenbei.
Simply means I take a sample, I shove it in a machine, I calculate the molecules that are there, and I get an exact date of when that plant died, or when that person died in the case of human biological material.
Okay.
But it simply means that the flax from which linen comes was chopped down in the 1st century. It stopped replenishing its carbon, and now we can get an exact date. But what they didn't tell you in 1988 was that each of these laboratories, again, Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, they got different dates. And even Arizona, because it got 2 strips, it got an initial strip, and they're, oops, sorry guys, we shortchanged you. Let me snip off another little sliver. So it's only 2 centimeters away, perhaps on the cloth, and yet there's some 200-year difference between Arizona 1 and Arizona 2, the 2 samples. And they didn't tell you that as you move left to right across the shroud, you go from an older date to a younger date. And so if it's 1240 and then 1440 within a couple of centimeters, like what's the date when I move 4.4 meters to the right? Like, is it a date in the future when I get over there? They didn't tell you any of this. They just said, oh, we're sure it's from the Middle Ages. It was just really disappointing. Now that all the data is out, And so I think you're absolutely right. Everybody's on the same page. We want to do it again. But I think the international...
How accurate is carbon dating?
How within... okay, some have said maybe they were wrong, but even that so, they're not wrong by that much. Like if you didn't have this theory of the French invisible weave, you would have to theorize some sort of contamination, whether by fire or by some fungus of sorts, or there'd have to be introduced a significant amount of organic material from another period in order to skew it that much, because it's precise to within a few years.
Okay.
It's actually not, it's not a matter of like 200 years or something like that. No,
Okay.
it is precise. But after
So do
this,
you think if this carbon dating was allowed to take place, that would settle the argument?
I mean, I think it would be helpful.
Settle the argument
that is
as
to say,
opposed to when it was
yeah,
first...
if it's done right, yes. I think, we should have followed the protocol that we initially established. 7 different samples from different areas of the shroud. Obviously, you're going to destroy, and therefore you want to be careful about where you choose to draw the threads from. And as, time advances, so does the technology. And so maybe we can destroy less material, and in such a way that you want to preserve, above all, the body image. And this is a relic, so you don't want to be haphazard about just
What's interesting is even if you take that theory that this is a medieval invention, which, as we've said, has been debunked, but even if you took that theory, you're still left to explain how the hell do you produce an image like this?
Well, that's right.
Even now, let alone in the Middle Ages.
And this is the question I like to ask my friend Barry Schwartz, because he's not a believer, and yet he travels the world talking about the authenticity of the shroud.
So what does he think it is?
Well, this is what I ask him. I say, well, because he likes to give this great analogy, which I follow. Like he says, I think it's a Sherlock Holmes episode or like a little short story or something, where Watson says, hey, Sherlock, Sherlock to Watson says, Watson, if you've got 4 theories or 5 theories in all.
That's the Hounds of Baskerville, I think.
Oh, look at that.
Where it's like all of the theories have been disproved, the least improbable.
It's the Hellhounds of Baskerville, and he says it's impossible.
You just like satisfied decades of my searching for that, because I forgot that. But I love the reference. So something like this, like if there are 5 theories on the table and 4 can be discarded or disproved, you can know, Watson, that the one that remains is surely true. And so it helped me.
When what is impossible is removed, whatever is left, however improbable, must be true.
Give this guy a raise,
all right.
okay? I don't know how much money you're making, but if that's your producer, like, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
so
no way Neil could have done that.
He's gonna cut, by the way, at the end of it. But so the naturalistic theories have been discarded. We know that it's not a painting. We know that it's not a scorch because of the ultraviolet fluorescence. We know that it's not a Camaro scorch. There are no highlights. There are no shadows. There's, like I said, there's nothing impressed upon the cloth. There's no directionality, no brush strokes. So if we're unable to reproduce it with any of these means, and by the way, I would be much more convinced if all of these debunkers were on the same page, because look, if it's a painting, it's not a scorch. If it's a scorch, it's not a rubbing. If it's a rubbing, it's not a photograph. It's like, guys, figure out which one it is, but it's not all 4. An argument. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But the other thing is, if all of those fail, and we can say this with, I use the word prove sparingly, but I use it here. We can prove that it's not any of those things. And so if all those naturalistic theories fail, this is where the Christian can raise it. Well, how about another idea?
Well, what's Barry's answer?
Oh, well, he'll just shrug his shoulders. And I think that's fair. Like if you want to be...
It's very Jewish kind of...
No, that is to say, he'll say, I don't know.
Disavow.
No, well, he holds out. He says, we can't explain it today. It's not that it's unexplainable.
But this is what the atheists do about the world.
I've just been informed I got the wrong Sherlock Holmes story.
Oh man. Okay, so
give her a raise. That took humility,
what was
brother.
Which one was it?
Sign of 4.
Okay.
I got to do some reading. Well, that's good. I learned something here today, so I'm happy. But I guess, where was I going with that?
He shrugs his shoulders.
He shrugs his shoulders.
And he says, there will be an answer. There isn't one now. And that's a fair...
I respect that. I respect that. The one who says, like, okay, you brought me to the brink, the limits of my knowledge.
I agree it's not paint. I agree it's not whatever.
And I can't explain it today, but maybe tomorrow we will.
So why? Okay, fair enough.
But I want to say this, is that we're all, at the end of the day, more than empiricists. Yes, as a scientist, qua scientist, I'm going to say, I can't explain this.
Yeah.
But I'm a man. I have all my faculties and I have to, at the end of the day, say yay or nay. What do I think? And there I have to take in all that I know. And I think this really does bring to the fore the question of the interplay between faith and reason. It's like reason brings you to the shore, and you've been walking, and now it's time to swim. But it's like, how much evidence do you need? Like, if I could just take one element just to highlight this, if we were to make a list of all of those candidates, all those people who were crowned and crucified, there's exactly one person on that list, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. If there are other people that were crowned and crucified, and that may have been the case, but nobody ever wrote about it. And so what's the probability that it's not Jesus when you have this unique combination of sufferings, that you have nail wounds in the feet and in the hands, a pierced side, evidence that he carried the cross, that he was nailed to the cross, that he was crowned with thorns, that he was punched in the face? All of this is here. And then you pile on other things like pollen that is consonant with the flora that blossoms between April and May within a radius of, I think, 5 kilometers of Jerusalem.
Das ist auch krass. Okay. Das ist krass.
And then you have soil.
This is a very elaborate kind of hoax.
Yes, no, I want to shake this guy's hand. Like, it's like, who is this guy? Like, this guy.
Forget the guy on the shroud.
Let's
Who's
worship
the
him.
guy?
Like, absolutely.
Yeah, if it's a fake, we need to like develop a following of whoever faked it, honestly, to some degree, because he's a genius.
Yeah, it's beyond genius. So just to give an example of this, like, there's soil. There's soil on the feet and knees and nose. It's terrible to think about what that implies for the Via Crucis. Like, when he fell flat to his face, and some 75 to 125 pounds came crashing down on a head crowned with thorns. So the forensic doctors don't agree on much, but they agree that those thorns penetrate through the skin to the bony plate below.
Oh, Jesus.
And so that on the, exactly, amen to that. But from a scientific point of view, we can study this soil that's on the feet, knee, and nose and determine its chemical composition. We know that it's calcium carbonate with a touch of strontium, and we know further its crystalline structure to be travertine aragonite, which is an extremely rare crystalline structure. And yet, according to one geologist, it matches the soil of the grottos of Jerusalem like a fingerprint, she says. And so, again, if it is fabricated in France in the Middle Ages, what in the world is it doing with soil from Palestine there, right precisely in those areas where it would have contact with the ground? And so it's the cumulative force of all of these different elements. I don't think it's any one thing that kind of like hammers it home. Sure, some are more important than others. Some elements are more important than others. But it really is the bringing together the convergent evidence that is again and again consonant with what we know from Scripture and what has been passed down and received by our tradition.
Who's the leading academic that would call this into question, and what does he say in response to this publisher retracting the original debunking of it?
Well, some have said, so Nicoletti is a book that just came out by, I want to say Baker or Baker Academic. I'm going to forget the title of the book, sorry. But there have been all kinds of debunkers along the way. In Italy, a big one is Garlaschelli. But there are, YouTube videos that you can easily find that will go into this. But they're basically holding on to the idea that this is a medieval fake, and that the carbon dating, though it wasn't definitive, if we were to do it again, I bet we get the same kind of 13th century outcome. And so... because remember, in 2017, what was shown was simply that you can't reach this conclusion. It might be by other ways we can reach that conclusion. It's simply that with the data that was used in 1988, it doesn't bring you to this conclusion. In other words, it's a non sequitur, right? You would need to do it again. But it does leave open the question. So it may be the case that maybe tomorrow, and this wouldn't be a problem. Some people have pretended that Christians are out there saying that the case for Christianity rests upon the authenticity of the shroud. Like, we would sleep easy tonight if we got a new test saying hey, you know what? The shroud is medieval, and it doesn't tell us anything about the sufferings. I think that would be kind of unfortunate. Like, I'm glad that there's
no way you would sleep easy if that was discovered, especially given what you've just shared about the pollen and the soil.
Okay, fair enough. I would be disappointed, but that is to say,
but it wouldn't
shake my faith in Christianity.
Shake the foundations of
my faith. My faith in Christianity. So our faith rests upon eyewitness testimony.
Yeah.
And what I think is really cool, I mean, obviously we have Mary Magdalene, we had the first apostles, they tell their story.
Vor allem, unser Glaube basiert nicht nur auf Augenzeugenberichten. So, Jesus sagte, guck, hier, du hast geglaubt, weil du gesehen hast. Wie viel seliger ist jemand, der glaubt, obwohl er nicht gesehen hat. Also es geht hier um den reinen Glauben an sich. So, im Prinzip könnte man sagen, es ist völlig egal, ob das Grabtuch und Jesus echt sind oder nicht. Es geht nur um den Glauben an sich, ob du es glaubst. So völlig unabhängig davon, ob du Beweise hast oder nicht, sondern so fest glaubst, als wäre alles bewiesen. So, darauf basiert quasi das Christentum, also auf den Glauben an sich, auf die Festigkeit des Glaubens, unabhängig von den Augenzeugen.
500.
Weil hier kommt nämlich die Sache mit den Augenzeugen. So, ich will fast sagen, das ist ja das Gemeine, aber es ist auch das Praktische, was Gott eingerichtet hat, so dass nur die Augen von Gläubigen sehen konnten. So, es heißt so, nachdem Jesus wieder auferstanden ist, konnten nur die Gläubigen, so die also Jesus gefolgt sind und die an ihn glaubten, die konnten ihn dann auch sehen. So Ungläubige, die sich für ihn verschlossen haben und gar nicht sehen wollten, also sag ich mal, die Bösen, die waren gar nicht in der Lage, ihn überhaupt zu sehen, beziehungsweise wenn sie ihn gesehen haben, waren sie nicht in der Lage, ihn wiederzuerkennen oder zu wissen, wen sie da vor sich haben. So ähnlich wird das auch bei der Entrückung sein. So, bevor Jesus zum zweiten Mal zurückkommt, wollte ich gerade sagen, bevor Jesus zurückkehrt, um die Erde zu richten. Vorher kommt ja noch die Entrückung. So, aber die Entrückung werden nur die Gläubigen sehen. Das heißt, zwar werden alle auf der Erde sehen, dass irgendwas passiert, so, aber die Entrückung an sich, also wie wir abgeholt werden, das werden nur die Gläubigen sehen. So, denn wer Gott nicht sehen will, kann Gott auch nicht sehen. Wer sein Herz für Gott verschließt, der wird auch die Effekte und so nicht in der Lage sein zu erkennen. Ja, wenn Gott sie wirkt. So nach dem Motto, wenn du eine Badewanne voller Wasser siehst, so und du glaubst einfach nicht an Wasserkräne, ja, dann wirst du sehen, dass irgendwie Wasser in die Wanne läuft, du wirst aber nicht sehen, woher. Was hat das Wasser in die Wanne gelassen? Ein Wasserkran? Ich glaube nicht an einen Wasserkran, kann gar nicht sein. Wenn du ihm dann den Wasserkran zeigst, ja, könnte alles Mögliche sein. Ich glaube nicht, dass es ein Wasserkran ist, so, weißt du? Und den Wasserkran können dann nur diejenigen sehen, die auch daran glauben, es gibt einen Wasserkran, der das Wasser in die Wanne lässt. Ich weiß, mein Beispiel ist jetzt nicht gerade so super, aber ich denke mal, es sollte verdeutlichen, was ich meine. So, ja.
Saw him at one time risen from the dead. And so these people, when they had nothing to gain and everything to lose, they went to their death professing faith in the resurrection. When it was known to be false, that people rise from the dead. Like nobody in the ancient world believed such a thing, that people come back from the dead to live new, glorified, resurrected lives. Like that's the premise and thesis of N.T. Wright's big book on the resurrection, right? Like Christianity came into a world where its central premise was already known to be false. And yet a whole swath of the society went on board and changed their day of worship from Saturday into Sunday because evidently they thought something happened on Easter Sunday. And so whether it's true or whether not, what you can't deny is that they believed it to be true. And so now you have to account as a historian, like, why in the world would they believe this?
Ja, auf einigen Verschwörungsseiten haben sie erklärt, ja, die mussten irgendwie das Christentum legalisieren, aber sie mussten die Juden loswerden, die den Samstag als ihren 7. Tag angesehen haben. So, aber sie wollten natürlich ihren Sonnengott, also die Sonne, wollten sie verherrlichen, also sind sie hingegangen und haben das Christentum auf die Art und Weise legalisiert, indem sie einfach den 7. Tag auf den Sonntag verschoben haben, so dass es für die dortigen Juden unmöglich war, dort noch weiter zu bleiben und sich zu beugen, so dass sie quasi von selbst auswandern und sich einen neuen Platz suchen mussten, um halt nicht Gefahr zu laufen, bei Gott in Ungnade zu fallen, weil für sie weiterhin der Samstag der 7. Tag war. Ne, so hat es eine der Seiten erklärt, als ich damals recherchiert habe, wie das sein kann, dass sie da plötzlich gewechselt haben. Fand ich auch eine interessante Erklärung.
And so what I think is cool is that those were eyewitnesses to the living Jesus. But if you were to ask, okay, who saw the moment that cadaver became a glorified, divinized human body? Nobody was there, right? Mary Magdalene gets up early, but not early enough, right? She's late. She slept in. He's gone. The tomb is empty. And so the shroud becomes the silent witness to that event, which I think is amazing because, of course, when she goes to the tomb, I know we call it an empty tomb, but what you read about is that it's not empty. In fact, it's what they find there that when they find it, the way that they find it, they begin to believe. And so I think it's so powerful that in John 20, verse 8, it says, John saw and believed. And this is where I want to take him by the lapels and be like, slap him across the cheeks a little bit. What did you see so that you believed? This is the first distinctive Christian faith attested anywhere in the scriptures. And it's
why can't that just mean he saw an empty tomb?
Well, what you described, can we pull that up actually? Because that's worth talking about. This is such a good question.
Oh, you'll look up the scripture?
Yeah, let's read that because I think this has not been given nearly enough attention in the scholarly literature and also with regard to shroud studies. And so I'm glad for the question. I'm just going to pull up my Bible here and I'll check it out in Greek.
And just for those who are watching right now, if you're a local supporter, go to mattfrad.locals.com. We've got a private chat going on so you can join that and ask questions. And I will be sure to ask Father your questions at some point in the episode. Do you want me to ask some of this, or have you already looked it up? I don't want to.
Yeah, no, I'm ready. So this is John chapter 20,
All right.
And this we know well because it's what we proclaim on Easter Sunday. It's the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb early while it's still dark and sees that the stone's been taken away, and so she goes and tells Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, that's John, and says, "They've taken away the Lord. He's not in the tomb. I don't know where they laid him." So Peter and John go running. And in verse 4, it says they're running together, but John goes faster. I guess Peter is a little older, a little slow, maybe a little extra pounds on the gut. I don't know. But he doesn't get there first. John does. I love this detail in verse 5. John bends down and says he stoops. He stoops, and the reason this is significant is because it coincides with what we know from archaeology in first century tombs.
Interesting.
There's a stairwell down that leads to an antechamber, and then against the wall, like on a shelf, much like in the catacombs if you've been there, you'll see that's where the body would lie. And so Simon Peter goes in first. But first, it's John who sees from a distance the linen cloths. That's the word that I'm reading. I'm reading from the ESV. If you get into different translations, you're going to get different vocabulary here. But the linen cloths, notice the S at the end. It's because in the...
So read it from the scriptures. It says what?
In verse 5, and stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths.
Interesting.
So it's blepe kemena ta othonia. So he sees the othonia. That's a neuter plural, and that's why we add S to the it's burial cloths or linen cloths. And the question is, what in the world was that? Especially since in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we get a different word. We get the word sindon, which is shroud, like a long sheet that covers. So it's a sindon in Mark, I think 15. Remember that young man that mysteriously is like runs away naked when they tear away his tunic or whatever? That's a sindon. That's a shroud. So it's evidently something big enough to cover a body. But the point is here that John, from a distance, he doesn't go in, but he gets low because now he gets a good angle to see deep inside. And what he sees from a distance is this linen cloth. Okay, that's interesting. But what happens next? Simon goes in. Like I can just imagine John saying, "After you, Holy Father," like he waited for Peter. And now Peter steps down the threshold of where the stone would have been rolled away into the antechamber, and he tells us what he sees coming into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths. That's the second mention of this word, othonia. And look at this. He saw the linen cloths lying there. In other translations, it adds funny words like lying on the ground. But I'm here in the Greek, and I can tell you that it does nothing of the sort. It just says, theore ta othonia kemena. He saw the linen cloths lying. And it's also interesting to note that he changed the verb to see. In English, we're going to get 3 times he saw, and he saw. But in John's language, he changes vocabulary, and I think that's intentional. It seems that there's a crescendo in light. He's seeing, but we're seeing more and more. So in a first moment, what does Peter see extra that John didn't see? Well, he sees the linen cloths lying and the face cloth, that's the sudarium, which had been on Jesus' head, it tells us, not lying with the linen cloths, that's a third mention in 3 verses of the same exact word, othonia, but folded up in a separate place. And you're like, come on, John, there are 1,000 details I wish I could know about the Passion of Christ. Like, how big were the thorns? Where did they pierce him in the side? How many scourge marks? But it's like relegated to a subordinate clause, and then he keeps on going. But boy, when it's time to tell you about the dirty laundry in the tomb, like he's going on and on about it. And that got to catch your attention. Like, what is the purpose? What is the purpose here? Where is he going with this discourse? And finally, in verse 8, he comes to the climactic conclusion to say, then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, that's John, right? He also went in and he saw and believed. And it's not blepo, that was the first verb. It's not theoreo, that's the second verb that Peter sees. But now it's horao, that he saw and believed. And so, especially being used in conjunction with the verb to believe, there's the sense that there's sight that is natural, and then there's sight that is supernatural. There's seeing, and then there's seeing, right? And these are the first baby steps towards that fundamental belief that, it founds the rest of our faith. If we take Paul seriously anyway, when he says, if Christ isn't raised, your faith is in vain. Like, it all rests upon this. And here's the testimony, bearing its witness. He saw. What did he see? There's a detail here. I wish I could jump in one of those time machines with Michael J. Fox or whatever, and like reconstruct the scene of like what exactly they saw. There's lots of fun theories out there. We can get into that if you want. But what I do know is this, that it's because he saw what he saw. In others, the condition of the empty tomb. And it's what's quoted in the Catechism, if I'm not mistaken. It's, what is it, 460? Or no, I think it's 640. I sometimes get dyslexia on these things. But it says that it's the condition of the empty tomb that led them to belief. And so whatever they saw, it started with something visible, something sensible. And so this is where I want to go to the text and say, like, okay, what clues do you got for me here? Anything? And there is something, and it's fundamental. It's not much, but it may just be all we need. I come back to that funky sentence that is translated with such difficulty. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and I told you in Spanish, for example, they say lying on the ground. We read this in our liturgy in Spanish. Wow. I think that's unfortunate because it doesn't say on the ground, as if the point were to say it's not on the staircase, it's not on the sill where his body lay. No, it's on the ground. No, that's they pulled that out of thin air. It doesn't say that. Nor does it say lying there, as if to say not here, but there. The word there is not in the Greek.
It's just not there.
It's just not there. But it does say that they're lying. And the word kemena can mean lying flat. So if the body has dematerialized, I don't like that term, but it communicates what I'm trying to get at. If the body is no longer there, such that the cloth that surrounded it can now collapse, the result might be described as a cloth lying. Like a balloon that's lost its air. It's got nothing inside, and so that it can collapse.
I see.
Add one more detail. The fact that it's a plural and not a singular. It's not a shroud, but it's the linen cloths. Okay, so what else do we know here? According to the American scientists, if you look to the beard, there's a depression in the beard evidencing a strap, a cloth that would have kept the mouth closed so that after rigor mortis relaxes, you wouldn't have a mouth just gaping wide open. It would be tied closed. Likewise, there's a strap evidently over the ankles but below the knees that's keeping the legs together. And so it seems that the man is taller on the front of the cloth than he is if you were to measure from the back, because there's a fold in the cloth because of this strap. And so some have theorized that in addition to the sindon, which is that long sheet that kind of folds above and below the body, you have these other strips that bring together at certain points and contain the body. This is really interesting if you know John 11, because that's when Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb, and he gives him a command. Do you remember what he says? As
Untie him, unbind him.
Untie him. There it is. And so evidently there's something to untie. And so could it be that something similar is here in Jesus' case, that John, who was there at the foot of the cross on Friday, and now he's back on Sunday morning, and he sees what he saw before, except no body.
Wow.
And so he might have described it in this way. The bottom line is this: what we have in the text says that it's not that he crucified his intellect when he came to believe. No, he departed from something that was intelligible and then carried it forward when he came into an encounter with Jesus. And that's where this itinerary ends. It moves from seeing certain details that are fuzzy and at a distance. Then we come up close and personal. And then we get the vision of faith, but then it climaxes in encounter when Mary Magdalene encounters the Lord. And that's where our faith journey ends too. You know, it's like, come press and probe, like study the shroud, but don't be unbelieving, but believe, see with faith.
Holy mackerel. Okay, so I know you want to draw out a lot of things from scripture. But can we get to some questions?
You bet.
But before we do that, can I tell people to go check out hallow.com/Matt? It is the #1 Christian. Matt Frad. I think Matt works as well.
Oh.
hallow.com/Matt Frad. You're right, Thursday. Matt Frad. Check him out because it's the #1 Catholic app on the interwebs. I think it might be the #1 Christian app. Don't quote me. It's a bloody fantastic app, and it'll help you to pray. And I know a lot of people for your New Year's resolution said you'd like to do that more. What's cool about Hallow is it'll help you do that. And it's really well produced. And if you go to hallow.com/MattFrad, the link is in the description below, and sign up there, you'll get a 3-month free trial, which is just ridiculous. So after the end of those 3 months, if you don't agree with me that it's as good as I'm saying, you can unsubscribe and you won't pay a cent. But it'll help you. It'll lead you through the rosary. It has nighttime stories, bedtime stories you can listen to. It has stories for your children that you can play for them at night. It really is absolutely excellent, and 100% Catholic. So if you want to pray the rosary, if you want to learn how to meditate in a Catholic fashion, please check it out. hallow.com/MattFrad. Click the link in the description below. Sign up there. That way they know that I sent you, and you'll get those 3 months for free. All right, can I
also sign up on the website so that you, I know a lot of people in the communities don't want to give more money to Apple or Google than they need to.
That's right.
So if you sign up on the website, then Apple and Google don't get a cut through the payment processing on your phone.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, so Heidi, thanks for being a local supporter, says, who is dragging their feet on the proper dating of it? Who has to approve it? So I think that goes back to the question of, okay, we did carbon dating, but it was on... So if a new carbon dating thing would actually prove it, whose permission do we got to get?
Right. So as of 1983, the shroud was bequeathed from the royal family to the person of John Paul II because he is the successor of Peter. So it is, as of 1983, that's like recent history. That's like yesterday in the grand scheme. Yeah. So now it is the property of Francis. Okay. So, of course, he has a delegate in Turin. It's the archbishop there in Turin. And he also has, people under him that tend to the nitty-gritty. But I think what would need to happen is that the scientific community would have to reach a kind of consensus in order to suggest, hey, this is not just what needs to be done, but the exact way in which it needs to be orchestrated so that the community at large can be confident that the results are credible. And so after the fiasco of 1988, nobody's just itching to do this. And I just want to say that we're in a great place right now to talk about the shroud. And we need more people. I love what I do. I love that I get to go around the world talking about the shroud, and I have in China and Hong Kong and Singapore and the Philippines and throughout Europe and here in the States. But I wish I didn't have to, in a way. Like, I wish there were other people that would get on board and do this. So thank you, by the way, for the platform to share this. But people need to know that they can get educated on this. Do a postgraduate certificate in shroud studies from Othonia. It's in Spanish, it's in Italian, and it's in English. And learn about it, share about it, bring it to your parish, bring it to your catechism classes. People need to hear this. You never know who can benefit from this kind of discourse. I think it's really sad that we've kind of dumbed down our catechesis. Our strategizing for evangelization has often been like more carpets in our chapels and more, electric guitars and that kind of thing. What if we were to like turn up the volume on the intellectual side of Christianity? I think some people need to hear some of these details, and you never know who can be helped. I've certainly seen it again and again in young people.
So we'll put a...
Ja. Nettes Schlusswort, wenn man so will. Ja, das restliche Video befasst sich noch mit anderen Fragen rund um das Grabtuch. Unter anderem geht es da dann auch um die forensischen Beweise, was Jesus durchlitten hat. In grafischen Details wird dann beschrieben, ja, wie er gefoltert wurde und so. Das muss ich aber jetzt an der Stelle, halte ich das nicht für relevant für dieses Video. Aber ich gehe mal davon aus, dass das, was ich zeigen wollte, oder das, was ich euch zeigen wollte, jetzt zu Genüge gezeigt wurde. Meine Güte, ja, Multitasking-mäßig. Ja. Darum ging es. Das waren die Sachen, die ich euch zeigen wollte. Also, dass wir 30.000 Milliarden Watt bräuchten, um das Bild zu reproduzieren. Ja, dass die ganzen Hinweise, die das Tuch liefert, also die Art und Weise, wie dieserjenige, der da in dieses Tuch eingewickelt war, was der durchlitten hat, die ganzen Details, so wenn man sich dann fragt, okay, wer war der Mann in dem Tuch, und man nimmt die ganzen Details, die das Grabtuch liefert, dann kann man gucken, okay, wen gibt es in der Geschichte oder gab es in der Geschichte der Menschheit, über den behauptet wird, dass er das durchlitten hätte. Dann kann man 1 und 1 zusammenzählen und kann dann auf das Ergebnis Jesus Christus kommen. Und dass wir immer noch nicht in der Lage sind, das Bild oder das Grabtuch so zu reproduzieren, dass wir ein authentisches Replikat haben. Nein, im Gegenteil, wir können beweisen, dass es nicht menschengemacht ist. Ja, und dass alle Wissenschaftler herzlich eingeladen sind, und auch alle anderen herzlich eingeladen sind, sich das mal genauer anzusehen und zu gucken, was haben wir hier? Ja, so viel dazu. Damit ist mein Ziel für heute erreicht. Ich leite euch dann jetzt weiter zu Alveus Sanctuary, weil ich sonst nicht weiß, an wen ich euch sonst weiterleiten kann. Dort könnt ihr ein paar Tiere in einem Gehege beobachten. Gerade im Augenblick einen afrikanischen Bullfrog, also Bullenfrosch, Krähen, ein Fuchs und ein paar Papageien. Alle ganz süß. Und ja, mir bleibt dann nur zu sagen an der Stelle, vielen lieben Dank fürs Zusehen. Ich wünsche euch noch einen schönen Montag und wir sehen uns beim nächsten Mal. Reingehauen.